The restaurant was full. Everyone was watching Elvis. Nobody noticed the homeless man at the door. When Elvis saw him, what he did next brought everyone in that restaurant to tears. Memphis, in the winter of 1976, carried a particular kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. The city streets, usually warm and welcoming, had transformed into harsh corridors where the wind whipped between buildings and the temperature dropped well below what most residents were accustomed to experiencing. For those fortunate enough to have warm homes and steady incomes, it was merely an inconvenience that required extra layers of clothing and higher heating bills. But for those living on the margins of society, winter in Memphis could be a matter of life and death. The homeless population, often invisible to the general public during warmer months, became impossible to ignore when temperatures plummeted and survival became a daily struggle. Shelters filled beyond capacity, and many found themselves with nowhere to turn for warmth, food, or basic human dignity. On this particular evening in late January, the affluent area of Memphis known for its upscale restaurants and entertainment venues was bustling with activity despite the bitter cold. Well-dressed patrons hurried from their heated cars into warm establishments, their primary concern being whether they had made dinner reservations early enough to secure the best tables. The contrast between the comfort of those with means and the desperation of those without had never been more stark. Among the most popular destinations that evening was Chez Philippe, an elegant French restaurant that had become a favorite gathering place for Memphis's social elite. The establishment prided itself on its sophisticated atmosphere, impeccable service, and discretion regarding its high-profile clientele. On any given evening, one might encounter prominent businessmen, local politicians, and occasionally entertainment figures who valued the restaurant's reputation for maintaining privacy. The restaurant's warm, golden lighting spilled out through large windows onto the sidewalk, creating a welcoming glow that contrasted sharply with the harsh streetlights and bare winter trees that lined the avenue. Inside, the sounds of conversation, clinking glasses, and soft jazz music created an atmosphere of refined comfort that insulated diners from the harsh realities of the world outside. But just beyond the restaurant's elegant entrance, barely visible in the shadows cast by the building's overhang, sat a figure that most passers-by either failed to notice or deliberately chose to ignore. Harold Thompson, a 58-year-old man whose life had taken a series of unfortunate turns, huddled against the cold brick wall with only a thin, tattered coat to protect him from the biting wind. Harold's story was one that had become all too familiar in American cities during the economic difficulties of the mid-1970s. A factory worker for most of his adult life, he had lost his job when the plant where he worked for 23 years closed its doors, moving operations to a location where labor costs were lower. Unable to find comparable employment and lacking the resources to retrain for a different profession, Harold had gradually exhausted his savings, lost his small apartment, and found himself living on the streets. The progression from working-class stability to homelessness had been swift and merciless. Within 6 months of losing his job, Harold had gone from being a productive member of society to being seen as a problem to be managed or, more often, simply ignored. His appearance had deteriorated along with his circumstances. His clothes were now worn and dirty, his face weathered by exposure to the elements, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen hope slip away piece by piece. As the dinner hour approached its peak, Chez Philippe was experiencing one of its busiest nights of the winter season. The warmth inside the restaurant created a stark contrast to the frigid conditions outside, and the establishment's reputation for excellence had drawn a particularly distinguished crowd. Wealthy patrons filled every table, their conversations creating a pleasant hum that mixed with the gentle sounds of classical music and the subtle clatter of fine china and silverware.
The restaurant's staff moved efficiently between tables, their professional demeanor reflecting the high standards expected in such an upscale establishment. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black bow ties attended to every need of their discerning clientele, while the sommelier made rounds to ensure that wine selections perfectly complemented each course. The maitre d' maintained his position near the entrance, greeting arrivals with the practiced charm that had made him indispensable to the restaurant's success.
Among the evening's diners were several prominent figures from Memphis society, including business leaders,
Local politicians, and cultural figures who had made the city their home. The atmosphere was one of refined sophistication, where conversations ranged from business dealings to cultural events, all conducted in the measured tones appropriate to such surroundings. What made this particular evening special, however, was the presence of Elvis Presley, who had arrived earlier with a small group of close friends for what was intended to be a quiet, private dinner. Word of his presence had spread discreetly among the staff and some of the other diners, but the restaurant's reputation for discretion meant that he was able to enjoy his meal without the usual chaos that accompanied his public appearances. Elvis was seated at a corner table that provided both privacy and a clear view of the restaurant's main dining room. He was dressed more casually than many of the other patrons, but his natural charisma and unmistakable presence made him the focal point of the room, despite his efforts to maintain a low profile. Throughout the evening, he had been gracious to the few patrons who had approached him, signing autographs and posing for photographs while trying to preserve the intimate nature of his dinner with friends. The conversation at Elvis's table was relaxed and wide-ranging, touching on music, current events, and shared memories of their long friendship. His companions included members of his inner circle who had known him for years and were comfortable enough to treat him as simply another friend rather than the global icon he had become. For Elvis, these moments of normalcy were precious, offering a brief respite from the constant demands and pressures of his celebrity status. As the evening progressed, Elvis found his attention occasionally drawn to the large windows that looked out onto the street. Something about the movement of shadows and the play of light from the street lamps caught his eye, though at first he couldn't identify what had captured his interest. His friends continued their conversation, unaware that Elvis's focus had begun to shift from their dinner to something happening outside. It was during a brief lull in conversation that Elvis's gaze settled on a particular shadow near the restaurant's entrance. What he initially thought might be a bundle of discarded clothing or debris gradually resolved itself into the shape of a human being. The figure was hunched against the cold, barely moving, and almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark brick wall of the building. Elvis's expression changed subtly as he realized he was looking at a person in distress. His friends, noticing the shift in his attention, turned to see what had captured his interest, but from their angle, the homeless man remained largely invisible. The strategic positioning of outdoor lighting and architectural features had created a blind spot that concealed Harold from the view of most people entering or leaving the restaurant. For several minutes, Elvis continued to observe the figure outside, his concern growing as he realized the person hadn't moved significantly despite the bitter cold. The temperature outside was dangerously low, and Elvis understood that prolonged exposure under such conditions could be life-threatening. His natural empathy, which had been evident throughout his life in his interactions with fans and his charitable activities, began to override the comfortable insularity of the restaurant's warm interior. The contrast between his own situation and that of the person outside was not lost on Elvis. He was surrounded by warmth, comfort, excellent food, and good company, while just a few feet away, separated only by glass and brick, another human being was struggling with the most basic challenges of survival. The dichotomy troubled him in a way that made it impossible to simply return his attention to the pleasant conversation at his table. Elvis excused himself from the table, ostensibly to visit the restroom, but instead made his way toward the restaurant's entrance. His movement through the dining room created a subtle stir among the other patrons, many of whom had been hoping for an opportunity to catch his attention. However, Elvis's focus was entirely directed toward the situation he had observed outside, and he moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision about what needed to be done. As he approached the entrance, Elvis could see Harold more clearly through the glass doors. The man was indeed in desperate condition. His clothing was inadequate for the weather. His posture suggested exhaustion and defeat, and his stillness was alarming. It was clear that this was not someone who was simply taking a brief rest, but rather a person who was genuinely struggling with homelessness and its attendant challenges.
The restaurant's maitre d' noticed Elvis approaching the entrance and moved to intercept him,
assuming that he might be preparing to leave and wanting to ensure that his departure was handled with appropriate discretion. However, Elvis's body language and facial expressions suggested something different than a typical exit, and the staff member hesitated, uncertain about how to proceed. Without announcing his intentions to the restaurant staff or his dinner companions, Elvis pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the brutal cold of the Memphis winter night. The temperature differential was shocking. The warmth and comfort of the restaurant gave way immediately to air so cold it seemed to burn his lungs with each breath. The wind, which had been merely a visual phenomenon from inside the restaurant, now attacked with a ferocity that made him understand just how desperate the situation must be for anyone forced to endure it without shelter. Harold looked up as the restaurant door opened, expecting to see another well-dressed patron who would hurry past without acknowledgement, as had happened dozens of times throughout the evening. Instead, he found himself looking at a figure who seemed oddly familiar, though his mind, dulled by hunger and cold, couldn't immediately place where he might have seen this person before. Elvis approached Harold with the same natural warmth and absence of pretension that had characterized his interactions with people throughout his life. There was no hesitation in his manner, no visible discomfort with the situation, and no indication that he was concerned about how his actions might be perceived by others. His focus was entirely on the human being in front of him, who was clearly in need of help. "Good evening," Elvis said, his voice gentle and respectful. "I couldn't help but notice you're out here in this terrible cold. Are you all right?" The question was asked with genuine concern, not the kind of perfunctory inquiry that might be offered by someone trying to ease their conscience before moving on. Harold struggled to respond, his voice hoarse from the cold and from lack of use. I'm okay, sir. Just trying to stay warm." His response was automatic, the kind of answer that homeless individuals often give when confronted by strangers, designed to minimize confrontation and avoid being seen as a problem that needed to be solved. But Elvis wasn't satisfied with this response. He could see that Harold was far from okay. His lips were blue, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The conventional social contract that allowed people to accept such obvious untruths in order to avoid involvement was not something that Elvis was prepared to honor. "When's the last time you had a hot meal?" Elvis asked, crouching down so that he was at eye level with Harold. This simple gesture, bringing himself down to Harold's level rather than towering over him, immediately changed the dynamic of their interaction from one of charitable condescension to one of human equality. Harold was taken aback by the directness of the question and the genuine concern evident in the stranger's voice. It's been a while," he admitted, his pride warring with his desperation. The truth was that he hadn't eaten anything substantial in 3 days, surviving only on occasional scraps and whatever he could find in dumpsters behind restaurants. Elvis stood up and extended his hand toward Harold. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone conveying the same warmth and interest he might show when meeting any new acquaintance. There was nothing in his manner that suggested he was dealing with someone beneath his social station or someone who should be grateful for his attention. "Harold," came the surprised response. "Harold Thompson." The act of stating his name seemed to restore some sense of dignity to the man, reminding him that despite his circumstances, he remained a person with an identity and a history. "Harold, I'm Elvis," came the simple introduction. Even in his confused and weakened state, Harold recognized the name and the face, though the surreal nature of his situation made it difficult to process what was happening. The idea that Elvis Presley was standing on a Memphis sidewalk in the bitter cold, talking to him as if they were equals, seemed too improbable to be real. "I'm having dinner inside with some friends," Elvis continued, gesturing toward the warm, well-lit restaurant. "Would you like to join us? I think you could use a hot meal and a chance to get warm." The invitation was extended with the same casual naturalness that one might use when inviting a neighbor over for coffee. Harold stared at Elvis in disbelief, unsure whether he had heard correctly or whether the cold had affected his mental clarity. The proposition seemed impossible that someone of Elvis's stature would invite a homeless man to dine with him in one of Memphis's most exclusive restaurants was beyond anything he could have imagined. I couldn't," Harold stammered, looking down at his disheveled appearance. "I'm not dressed for a place like this. I don't belong in there." His response reflected the internalized shame that homelessness often brings, the sense that one has become unworthy of normal human society and its customs. Elvis's response was immediate and firm. "Harold, you belong anywhere I invite you, and right now I'm inviting you to have dinner with me." He reached out and gently took Harold's arm, helping him to his feet. "Besides, the only thing that matters is that you're a human being who needs help, and I'm a human being who can provide it." The simplicity and sincerity of Elvis's words cut through all the social barriers and preconceptions that typically govern such interactions. Harold found himself being guided toward the restaurant entrance, still unable to fully believe what was happening, but too overwhelmed by gratitude and cold to resist. As Elvis and Harold approached the restaurant's entrance, the maitre d' and several staff members who had been watching through the windows found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. Chez Philippe prided itself on maintaining certain standards regarding dress codes and clientele, but they were also dealing with Elvis Presley, one of the most famous people in the world and certainly someone whose wishes carried considerable weight. The maitre d' stepped forward as they entered, his professional training warring with his uncertainty about how to handle this unusual situation. "Mr. Presley," he began carefully, "perhaps we could arrange for a takeout order for your friend?" The suggestion was offered as a diplomatic solution that would allow Elvis to help Harold without disrupting the restaurant's atmosphere. Elvis's response was polite but unambiguous. "Thank you, but Harold will be dining with us at our table. Could you please bring him a menu?" His tone was pleasant but carried an undertone that made it clear this wasn't a request that was open for negotiation. The staff member hesitated for a moment, glancing around the dining room where other patrons had begun to notice the unusual situation unfolding near the entrance. Some diners were staring openly, while others were making an effort to appear disinterested while clearly paying close attention to what was happening. "Of course, Mr. Presley," the maitre d' replied, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. Whatever his personal feelings about the situation, he understood that accommodating Elvis's wishes was far more important than maintaining rigid adherence to typical protocols. As Elvis guided Harold through the dining room toward his table, the reaction from other patrons was mixed and complex. Some appeared genuinely moved by Elvis's gesture of kindness, recognizing it as an act of spontaneous generosity that reflected well on his character. Others seemed uncomfortable with the presence of someone who was clearly homeless in their upscale dining environment, though they were reluctant to voice their objections openly. The conversations at nearby tables had quieted significantly, with many diners stealing glances at the unusual pair making their way across the room. Harold was acutely aware of the attention he was drawing and felt deeply self-conscious about his appearance, but Elvis's calm confidence and the protective way he stayed close to Harold's side provided reassurance and dignity to the situation. When they reached Elvis's table, his friends looked up with expressions of surprise and curiosity. Elvis had left to use the restroom and was returning with a homeless man in tow. This was certainly not something they had anticipated when they agreed to join him for a quiet dinner. "Everyone, "I'd like you to meet Harold Thompson," Elvis said, introducing his new companion with the same warmth and respect he would show any friend. "Harold, these are some good friends of mine." He then proceeded to introduce each person at the table by name, giving Harold the courtesy of proper introductions and treating him as a valued guest rather than a charity case. Elvis's friends, taking their cues from his behavior, welcomed Harold warmly and made space for him at the table. A waiter quickly brought an additional chair and place setting, and Harold found himself seated among some of the most influential people in Memphis, being treated as if he naturally belonged in their company. The conversation at the table resumed, but with a different quality than before. Elvis made sure to include Harold in the discussion, asking about his background and treating his responses with genuine interest. Harold, gradually warming up both physically and emotionally, began to share his story, his years as a factory worker, the plant closure that had cost him his job, and the series of setbacks that had led to his current situation. As Harold spoke, the other diners at the table listened with attention and sympathy, recognizing that his circumstances could have befallen anyone facing similar economic challenges. His dignity and intelligence became apparent as he described his attempts to gain new employment and the barriers he had encountered due to his age and the changing job market. Elvis ensured that Harold received the full restaurant experience, encouraging him to order whatever appealed to him from the menu and making sure his water glass was kept full and his needs were attended to by the staff. The meal that followed was elaborate and expertly prepared, representing more food than Harold had seen in weeks. As Harold ate, the transformation in his appearance and demeanor was remarkable. The nourishment and warmth began to restore some of the vitality that harsh circumstances had drained from him, and his participation in the conversation became more confident and animated. Elvis watched this transformation with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that his simple act of invitation was having such a positive effect. Throughout the meal, other diners in the restaurant continued to observe the scene with varying degrees of interest and approval. Some were clearly moved by Elvis's gesture and the gracious way he was treating Harold, while others remained skeptical or uncomfortable with the situation. However, the overall atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted towards something more thoughtful and emotionally engaged than the typical social dining experience. As the evening progressed, what had begun as a simple act of kindness evolved into something much more significant for everyone involved. Harold, who had started the day believing that he was invisible to the world and had no value to society, found himself engaged in meaningful conversation with people who treated him with respect and genuine interest. For Elvis's friends, the experience provided insight into both their companion's character and the realities faced by those less fortunate than themselves. They witnessed firsthand how quickly circumstances could change someone's life, and how easy it was for society to overlook those who had fallen through the cracks of the economic system. For the restaurant staff and other patrons, Elvis's actions served as a powerful reminder that celebrities and public figures had the power to influence social attitudes through their behavior. His treatment of Harold with dignity and respect challenged assumptions about homelessness and demonstrated that all people deserve to be treated with basic human consideration. As the meal concluded, Elvis insisted on paying for Harold's dinner and arranged for him to receive additional assistance. He provided Harold with money for temporary housing and connected him with social services that could help him find more permanent solutions to his situation. But perhaps most importantly, he had given Harold something that money couldn't buy, a sense of dignity and the knowledge that he remained a valuable human being despite his circumstances. The story of that evening would be told and retold throughout Memphis and beyond, becoming part of the legend that surrounded Elvis Presley. But for those who were present that night, it represented something more than just another anecdote about a famous person's generosity. It was a demonstration of the power that simple human kindness could have to transform lives and challenge social assumptions about who deserved respect and consideration. Harold Thompson's life took a dramatic turn following that evening. With Elvis's help, he was able to find temporary housing, access social services, and eventually secure employment that allowed him to rebuild his life. But even more than the practical assistance, the dignity and respect he had been shown that night had restored his faith in humanity and his own sense of self-worth. For everyone who witnessed Elvis's gesture that cold winter night in Memphis, the experience served as a lasting reminder that greatness is measured not just by talent or success, but by how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. In choosing to see Harold's humanity rather than his circumstances, Elvis had demonstrated the kind of character that made him truly worthy of the admiration he received from millions around the world.